Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Claude. There's been a lot of talk about sustainability and problems with the environment and stuff over the past few years, but more recently, and I guess in 2022, having spent a bit of time in Europe, I just noticed how front and center it is in every news and political conversation there versus maybe a bit less in North American media that we see. And I've just seen an explosion of startups and new companies and new technologies and solutions trying to solve problems to do with the environment. I often feel personally that when I hear stuff about the environment's our trouble, we have to solve problems with the environment, I don't necessarily feel like it's the best framing. Because the environment is literally everything. And sometimes it causes confusion just talking too broad like that. So it would be interesting from your perspective, and maybe you could give the audience just a brief background on your role with the government of British Columbia, what you're working on before getting into this. But it would be quite interesting to hear from your perspective how you've seen this space evolve over the past years, and just what does the overall landscape look like today, and what problems are we trying to solve?
My role with the BC government is around digital trust and ESG reporting, and specifically for mining and natural gas operators in British Columbia. I agree with you. I think that there is a greater emphasis, more and more focus, particularly on climate change. I think this is really a result of it impacting people more and more. Folks seeing changes to the temperature where they live, increasing storms. I think it's starting to come home to people that it's happening, and it is a real concern for folks. And but I also agree with you that sometimes the framing can be very overwhelming, and it's hard to sort of think about how, as individuals, we can contribute to reducing climate change and addressing all of the issues with the environment, biodiversity challenges. And I think the way that's manifested for me in my job, I've been working on this file for almost 2 years. And I find that it's a constant exercise of focusing on what aspect of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance reporting, is most important or is the most tangible for my particular ministry, and focusing on it in ways that we can actually improve the reporting that's done, or enable industry within British Columbia to do better ESG reporting and have better sustainability performance. So yeah, I think that there are tangible, concrete ways in which we can achieve those goals, but it definitely, certainly when I started in my role, I was felt completely overwhelmed by all of the different frameworks that are out there for this type of reporting, and just the magnitude of all of the different issues that we're facing.
Maybe going a little bit deeper into the sectors you talked about, mining specifically, what are some of the reporting requirements on this industry? And are there reporting requirements to, obviously we're talking about the province here, but are there federal, municipal requirements? Are there global requirements? What are requirements on private sector companies? And let's just use the example of a mining company, since we're focusing on this specific use case.
The requirements that I'm aware of are at the provincial level, particularly around climate data. So in BC, any operator that emits above a certain threshold has to report their GHG emissions on an annual basis to the government of BC. And this is a legislated process. In terms of ESG reporting, my understanding is that that reporting is voluntary. Companies that have, sort of very sophisticated sustainability reporting teams are in a better position to do that reporting. But I think it can be very daunting for smaller operators to get a sense of which frameworks they should be reporting against, and if it's multiple, then how they coordinate their reporting.
From your perspective, Kyle, now that you've gotten more and more familiar with climate data reporting or carbon reporting specifically, where have you seen some problems that maybe Nancy refers to here, that it could be daunting at times based on maybe a lack of information, but maybe the process itself is daunting as well? Where does digital trust and digital identity fit in to all of this?
Yeah, so the couple challenges with the sustainability reporting is the data standards, for sure. Right now, a lot of the data that we see is not consistent, and it's often, I wouldn't say massaged, but it has a lot of context added to it. So, for example, some of the numbers that you might see in an ESG report from a company have a lot of context, a lot of different standards, and it's difficult to compare Company A and Company B's ESG reports to see how they're comparable, really. This is because they potentially use different standards, or they've got different boundaries that they're including or excluding for Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2 emissions, maybe even Scope 3. So that's one of the biggest things that we see for is the data standards, and the actual, when it comes down to the actual attribute information, that's where we see a challenge for comparing apples to apples. The other is the actual format of the data. So right now, an ESG report essentially is a PDF that's published to a website, and so it takes a human to read through that information and interpret it. It's not, again, it's very difficult to compare. Certainly by a human, it's difficult to compare, but it's impossible by a machine in that kind of a format. So that's the other aspect, is getting the actual data formats into the same space. So a lot of the work that we're doing with the verifiable credentials, digital credentials, is defining schemas for the data transport from an issuer to a holder, and then from that holder to an end consumer or verifier.
This could be a question for either one of you, and feel free to jump in if you want to add anything after questions. I don't necessarily need to be asking them to either one of you specifically, but how does, it's interesting you said, Kyle, that there's inconsistency in the data standards. So even within an industry like mining, there's inconsistencies in the data standards?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily inconsistency. They're just using different standards. And this is because they're maybe more familiar with a GRI standard versus TCFD versus SASB. And these are all, standards that are used in the industry, but they're just all different, and they have different ways of calculating. So that's one aspect of it. The other one is when you start looking at comparables, one company might have multiple facilities, and so they've done reporting per facility, where another company may have been reporting at a corporate level, and so it's all inclusive of all of the facilities. And so that just makes it difficult to compare.
And what is the origination of the data here? If you have one mine or multiple mines, different facilities, is it a mix of human inputted data and machine data? Kind of what is the provenance or the source of the generation of the data?
Yeah, good question. We're actually working with our stakeholders in our ecosystem right now to define where is the source of the information. In some cases, it is actually an electronic measuring device of some kind, a sensor in some cases. And so that electronic device at the very, very source point is reporting information from that device to maybe a centralized system used by the company. And they draw the information from there to be included in their annual reporting. In some other cases, it's a human measuring something on a regular basis, maybe a weekly basis or something, using some sort of manual device or even a handheld device to, again, write down in a little notebook, which eventually gets transcribed into Excel or inputted into a system. And then one of the other cases is they're actually, for GHG emissions specifically, something like diesel fuel, they're actually looking at invoices from the delivery company that they get the diesel fuel from. And so it'll say so many liters, so many thousands of liters of diesel, was used in a certain month, and that's actually on their invoice that's from the delivery company, and that's what they're using as an input to how much they're consuming.
So it sounds like there's a big area of focus that needs to happen in sustainability reporting, is really just the quality of data, right? And then being able to ensure that you have, I don't know if provenance is a requirement here, but that you really have the quality of data, because it just goes back to, you could have a great process or great record keeping or be using credentials or whatever solution, but if it's garbage data that comes in, it doesn't really solve the problem at the end of it, however fancy of a tool you're using.
I would say quality and comparability. To Kyle's point, there's so many different standards out there. I think that as we've been working with global carbon accounting platforms and trying to understand the way that carbon data is aggregated at a global level, it seems like the gold standard. And I don't think that this is something that happens at the moment, but sort of it's something that's looked forward to, is triple verified. So there's self-reported data by the facility. They also would have like an IoT sensor device measuring at the facility on the infrastructure, and then potentially also have satellite imaging of any GHG leakage from their facility. And all of those different sources of data could be included on credentials and together be compared and to come at the most accurate reading of that particular facility's emissions.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one of the things that we're also hearing about in the industry when it comes to this digital credential technology is the use of IoT devices. And so in some of those cases, it'll be an IoT device that's got a sensor built into it that's attached to some piece of equipment. And that IoT device is what we would consider the issuer of the information, and the holder would still be that company. But the trust comes from that certification of that IoT sensor, or the calibration that's been done by a third party or something like that. And so that's where the actual trust comes for that piece of data. So that will exclude any sort of hand measured thing by a human and then transcribed. There are potentials for errors in there. So the trust mechanism really comes down to that IoT device. Not that that's the only way you can do it, but that's what we're hearing a lot in the industry, is the move towards having IoT sensors that are issuing type of information. Again, certified. It also increases the frequency of reporting so that they can get more fine-grained on the actual operations. So they can use that not only for the GHG emission reporting, but they can also use that to improve the efficiency of their operations.
It's a really interesting use case for innovative digital trust technology, because it's a way of using this technology to decrease the potential of greenwashing, which is something that ESG and sustainability reporting gets accused of often. So the whole point of ESG reporting and sustainability reporting is to get an understanding of the baseline of that company's performance so that they can undertake continual improvement. And if you can increase the trust in that reporting, then you're only strengthening the effort.
We're talking a bit about trust now, and if we just take a step back from talking about the specifics here of what this type of reporting is, certain processes, the space overall, how did your group come up with this initiative? And how did you get, I think people are often trying to figure out how do you start a digital ecosystem? How do you start a digital trust ecosystem? How did this all come about? And how did you get the ball rolling with different stakeholders that you have to work with and getting people around a table and making decisions, which could be hard at times, but how did this whole thing get started?
Well, I inherited this project. It's a project that was the genesis is that we have in BC a number of different folks within the government who have been strong advocates and contributors to open source digital trust and SSI technology, and have been advocating that for individual identity for a number of years. And my ministry took it on as a pilot for how we could use that technology to improve the reporting processes for mining and natural gas operators within BC, and enable them to be able to share information about their sustainable performance in a way that was more efficient and more trusted. So that was the beginnings. That was sort of the reason why the project was undertaken in the first place. And then in terms of building the ecosystem, it was really, Kyle and I joke sometimes that we're like a little startup company within government. It's a government project, of course, it's for the public good, but it's that ethos of, just reaching out to people and getting a sense of who's interested in adopting and who's interested in piloting with us and sort of testing this out and seeing where it can go and what lessons we can learn. So we just built the group of stakeholders that way. And it's like a snowball that we're creating. And once you sort of push it down the hill a little bit, it starts to build on its momentum. We got introduced to other stakeholders through the connections that we had made. And it's built into the fairly extensive now group of stakeholders, industry members, government regulators, digital markets that put up a price premium on products that are certified as responsibly produced. A whole host of different actors. Oh, auditors as well. We have a number of auditing companies.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the other side of it is the technology that we're using with this verifiable credentials. So we're using the Hyperledger stack, Indian Aries with the non-creds. And so that's something that's also was put before us, before we both started on the project by the rest of the BC Gov technology team, who's been doing it for personal credentials and business credentials. So those familiar with what BC Gov has done before, the org book was something that was developed to store verifiable credentials for business licenses for any businesses registered in British Columbia. So we had the fortune to benefit from those that have gone before us and use that same technology stack to continue on. And we're still doing that today. We're collaborating with folks at Citizen Services still on our ecosystem and more importantly, the technology. We have different use cases that we're doing, but we're able to collaborate quite well on the technology stack.
How did you come up with the initial use case? And I'm assuming one initial use case is needed to start identifying what parties need to be involved here. So how did the use case come about specifically? And then did you have to incentivize certain stakeholders to join, or kind of what was the project, the whole process of getting this kind of booted off the ground?
So the first step was, we had a lot of different use cases that we were brainstorming about, but the one that seemed to be the most interest to the most stakeholders was around GHG reporting. I think that this is something that is true throughout the industry. ESG is looking at environmental, social, and governance components, but the carbon emissions component is measurable. Kyle was talking a little bit earlier about some of the issues with the data, but comparatively, it is actually, there are standards out there for carbon emissions data. And also in BC, we have a legislated process for GHG reporting to the government. So we decided that we would map that process because for a number of different reasons. It's pre-existing and the technology is, still fairly new and isn't widely known. So we figured that having a process that was already very, tried, tested, and true, and then mapping to that would help with adoption. Also, in terms of governance of the process and what was contained on the credential, it's mapping to a process that's written down in legislation and regulation. It's all publicly available. So that was a simplifying element to the use case. Also, we partnered with PwC, an auditor and verification company that are one of the ones that are registered and under the regulation. They're designated as an auditor. In terms of having that trust anchor, that authority, a governance authority in place, that was one of the factors. And then also the fact that, GHG emissions data is available. And then I guess the third component was that it is of so much interest. So it was, that was probably the use case where all of the different actors were the most interested in being involved.
That use case we kept simple intentionally with 3 different actors, one issuer, one holder, one verifier, so that we could have a complete end-to-end kind of a use case with one credential and just keep things very simple. And so we worked through all those pieces with that use case. And then the expansion of the ecosystem after that took on a life of its own in a sense. And Nancy, I feel like we let it organically grow to a certain degree based on which stakeholders showed interest in the pilots. So we added other issuers, other credentials, other holders or companies in the middle, and then other verifiers. And it still today is still evolving and growing, again, organically based on the stakeholders' interest. I don't see that actually ever stopping. I see that as one of the benefits of this open standards, open technology, where it can just take on a life of its own and different stakeholders can get involved or not, and they can use certain credentials that they're interested in sharing or getting, and it will just evolve on its own without our direction. Again, it's an open ecosystem. It's not a closed, structured ecosystem where we're letting certain people in. Our role of our team is more to help facilitate and coordinate involvement in the ecosystem. I wouldn't even necessarily call it our ecosystem anymore. Yeah. It's just that's what's out there now.
Yeah, and that's the end goal, is for the BC government to just be one actor within this ecosystem. We still see actually a role for us in facilitating it and enabling it, but eventually it will be at a maturity level where we won't need to be the ones sort of driving it, I guess. It would, the use cases will be of value, enough value so that any stakeholder will just be able to onboard themselves and start exchanging credentials, and will want to do that, will be incented to do that, because it will add efficiency to their processes and also increase trust in the data that they're exchanging.
I think even if you have a member like an auditor that's performing a specific task, once they're set up, that's the cool thing with these technology protocols and the standards that are used here. Once they're set up to do one use case, there's nothing stopping them from doing a second and a third and a fourth use case with the same stack. Unlike a lot of the IT world today, where if I want to integrate an API, that's a whole procurement process for my company, and I have to go through all of that. And if I want to do a second use case, it's a whole other thing. And so it simplifies a lot of things on the technology side of things. I think one of the underestimated pieces of work that your group has been working on is just defining different types of governance on different levels of this ecosystem, if we want to call it that. How did you start defining governance of the ecosystem? Were there frameworks that were used to do that? And are there maybe learnings of, I think you mentioned, Nancy, it's a public good and you're creating an open ecosystem. There's a lot of examples of governments creating closed ecosystems for digital ID programs. So how do you have to look at governance, or how did your group go about it here to make sure that, as you said, you could just end up at the end of the day, one entity within this ecosystem, controlling the four walls around it?
Just as a personal learning, I think that it's choosing use cases where you don't have to reinvent the wheel on governance. Having legislated or regulatory processes that you can point to has, just from a project management perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of the more involved governance processes, Kyle is the real expert on this and has taken a lot of time to dig into all of the different levels of governance that are required and how they actually map to our project and what we're trying to build in terms of a public good and public digital infrastructure.
One of the main frameworks that we're using for the definition of governance is the trust over IP frameworks that have been, a lot of great work has been done by the Trust Over IP Foundation as far as governance for frameworks. There's a meta model, which we used a lot of, their governance meta model to define what governance was even needed for the whole ecosystem. There's in Trust Over IP, there's 4 layers. And so there's the utility layer, number 1, peer-to-peer transaction layer, number 2, the trust triangle, the traditional trust triangle, layer 3 for the actual transactions between the peers, and then the layer 4, the ecosystem. And so what we did was we worked with IBM to define some governance frameworks for our specific needs. So a layer 1 and a layer 2 governance documents were put together. And then the layer 3 and the layer 4, those are more specific to the credentials and the actual transactions. And so those are the ones that, those governance documents are ones that our team has been working on. So for example, the regulatory reporting use case for GHG emissions, we've defined at least a draft for governance framework for what that credential that's required for the regulatory reporting looks like. And so that definition is, at the end of the day, it's a markdown file in a GitHub repo, and it's got a nice introduction, talks about the different attributes of data in the non-creds format for that schema that's defined. We talk about what each of those attribute values is, and that's what Nancy mentioned, links back to the actual regulation in law for BC government regulations. And so that's where we can draw from when we define governance, at least, is to use an existing standard. And in this case, it's a BC government regulation that is the standard for the regulatory reporting. For voluntary reporting, it would be looking at something like a TCFD or GRI standard or specification. You can draw from those to define your schemas and your governance that's for that credential. And then also you can layer on that what business processes, what specific transactions, What does an issuer need to do to be able to rightly issue a credential? Is there a registry that those issuers need to be part of? Is there a accreditation that an issuer needs to have? All those kinds of rules or policies can be built into that governance framework so that somebody coming into that space that might want to say, okay, well, I want to hold one of those credentials. Who are the issuers that I need to potentially get that from? It can be laid out in there. And then who I might be presenting to. What other credentials, sometimes credentials go side by side, maybe a business license and then also a report need to be linked together so that you are proving that you are the company that you are, and then you are able to report the information, with that kind of backing of who you are. So that's a lot of the governance work that we've been involved in, writing draft documents as Markdown. We're continuing work on that so that it can be more easily accessible. So Markdown files aren't the most accessible for people, A, to write, and B, to read. We don't want to have everybody logging into GitHub to have to, edit a Markdown file and read that Markdown file. So we're taking on some work to see what we can do for making that more easily accessible, both on the input and the output part of the governance documentation. That said, there is a lot of governance that already exists. And so we're also looking at how we can leverage the governance that already exists. In today's space, in a Web 2 kind of space, a lot of that looks like just, sort of process steps that are exposed on a public website or potentially a private website. But even the regulatory reporting process that we're talking about for GHG emissions is already exposed on the public website for the BC government. There's instructions for companies who need to do reporting. It lays everything out. There's templates people can download to fill out web forms and Word docs and those kinds of things. All of that I would consider governance for that process and for the data standards and the things that are involved in that. And so we're just leveraging that and doing it in a little bit of a more structured way. So the other thing on governance is what I've talked about so far is just the human readable side of governance. The other important side with the technology layer is to look at what can be done for machine readable governance is the term that we're using. And so that is going to be files, probably still in the same GitHub repository, but it's files with lists of, let's say, trusted issuers or schema definitions or, attributes, different things that the actual technology, so an agent or wallet, can grab that from that repository, hold on to it, and use that information to do those transactions with the users. So it would have built into it, the trust registries for issuers and verifiers, any schemas that are important, any potentially presentation definitions, any workflows, those kinds of pieces. So those would be essentially code or lists of, DIDs or the decentralized identifiers that those systems can actually use in these transactions.
What's really cool with a lot of the technology in the space is that by it being, or at least a lot of it, and the ones that are commonly accepted that will drive interoperability and privacy preserving interactions and such, they're all open source. You mentioned it's kind of been important from your side that a lot of the outputs on the governance are made kind of open and accessible as well. At least the human readable stuff so far for now. If I'm another kind of public service ministry, public sector ministry, trying to offer public good to my citizens, and I have a specific kind of legislation or specific use case that already exists in Web 2, does the governance work that's been done and made kind of public by your group, does that become composable as well? Like, are there elements of that that are not necessarily linked to the specific use case that could just be more broadly used by another public sector entity, or even just more generally speaking on the internet?
I would say yes. There, in that governance stack, there are common pieces. So layer 1 and 2, for the most part, those are reusable and applicable to all use cases, all ministries, all business processes. So really the focus comes down to the actual data structures, so the schemas of what's being transported, and then any related business processes. Now, what we've seen is that government involvement in the use case, in the ecosystem, the use cases are primarily issuing and verifying, potentially doing both. Like the same program would issue a credential to a company or a citizen and then want to verify that when that company or citizen comes back to the government to want to do some type of transaction. So that's one common piece there. Those layer 3 and layer 4 governance documents, once we get a few kind of under our belt, those will be, I believe, very reproducible. And the other thing to say is from a government perspective, all of those processes and data standards are generally exposed, in a public good kind of a sense, on the web for the different government websites. So even something like a fishing license or something like that, it's pretty clear, what steps you need to do to get one of those, what it's used for, all the data attributes, what the thing looks like, that's fine, right? So that's the Web 2 version of the, even if, or it could be Web 1, where it's just a physical credential, those kinds of ideas.
Are you seeing interest, Nancy, within the BC government itself, like other ministries? There was a mention of citizen services and collaboration there. Do you see a lot of the work that you're doing on governance and even the technology and just the process of getting this ecosystem going? Are you seeing interest from kind of a broader audience within the government of British Columbia?
We really haven't been advertising it too much within the BC government. And even so, we've got interest from, other natural resource ministries. I think that folks can see the value of this for supply chain tracing, and also can get the efficiencies that it could bring to a lot of different processes. If we made a concerted effort to go out and educate within the public service around what we're doing and how it's going to potentially be offered as a common service for all different agencies and ministries, I think that the penny would drop pretty quickly for others within government, because we've been so focused on our own use cases that we haven't really done that dog and pony show around government to tell others what we're up to. And we still have a lot of interest from Ministry of Agriculture, fisheries, forestry. I think any ministry where there's an element to their work of working with industry and on commodities that are exported or traded. That's another use case, which I think is a very one that will be very extremely valuable. Being able to have access to trusted data that you can share in a way that's efficient and easy with potential purchasers, with potential investors into your project, I think that is something that will be of use, and folks are already starting to think through how that can work, and how digital credentials can reduce trade friction, increase trust in between the two companies that are doing cross-border trade. So I think we often joke that the use cases are endless for this technology, and we're already seeing interest within the government, but I think that if, once there's, I think that there's going to be, I don't think that the interest is going to diminish. I think it's only going to grow as people understand the technology and what it's capable of doing. I think probably the biggest blocker at the moment is just a lack of understanding. It's so the application of this technology and the way that we're doing it is new, and it's not something that's been done particularly by governments per se. So there's a lot of different elements to it that folks need to wrap their heads around in order to understand exactly what it is that we're doing and how then it could actually apply to what they're doing within their own ministries.
What is a blockchain, Kyle? Is that where you start your education?
That's where we start the education. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's almost like breaking down people's assumptions about blockchain and then building back up based on what we're actually doing using distributed ledger technology. There's definitely, I think education has to be a big focus. And in fact, when we moved into the second year of our project, we created a whole team around communications and change management and providing background information packages for new stakeholders when we were looking to onboard people. So I think that communications piece is very important for a project like this. Being able to communicate what we're doing and the value of what we're doing to all different audiences who are super technical, those who are curious but don't really get it, and then those who they have 5 minutes to think about this, and you have to be able to tell them what you're up to and why, and so that elevator pitch kind of perspective as well.
Just to add to that, there's a few practical things that we've learned along the way for education and talking to stakeholders about what all this verifiable credential and self-sovereign identity space is. So the first one is often it helps to compare it to business processes where email is used as either an integration point or just a communication method between maybe the government and a company, whatever kind of communication happens there. And then the next thing to add to that would be what attachments are added to your email that you're sending back and forth. So in the example of a regulatory process between PricewaterhouseCoopers and a mining company, PricewaterhouseCoopers is emailing a PDF, a signed PDF along the way. And that's often a good comparable to process that we're doing today, and where a verifiable credential is an important sort of replacement for that type of technology, so that it's not a PDF, it's some actual attributed data that can be attested to. And other interesting things that come along with that is you don't need to DocuSign a PDF with a signature. It's actually a digitally signed, cryptographically piece of data. That's the thing that you're trusting. You don't need to trust that somebody had, a PNG file or a GIF file of somebody's signature that they're faking on a PDF. Those kinds of things. You can see that the true trust is very similar to certificates, the SSL certificates that some people might be familiar with in web technology.
I really like the email and PDF comparison because I think email is still by far the most common communication method that's used today, and kind of the closest thing that we could get to getting kind of a direct interoperable communication between two people or two entities. And
just to extend the email metaphor, the fact that you can send an email with Gmail and you can send it to an Outlook email address, and that those are all interoperable. I think that's that resonates for people as well. And being able to work with companies like yours, met you like Northern Block, and other tech partners that we have around, who are willing to pilot with us and show interoperability between all of the different solutions. That's been a really powerful part of the project as well.
When we're looking at some of those use cases, a couple things that we look at is the actual need for where they're looking at a use case where there is a need for trusted data. And that often shows up as something that needs to be third-party verified or audited, at least in a business context. And so that's something that we often looked at. And so that's why our regulatory process fits well. And to go a little bit deeper on the regulatory process, there's only a certain threshold where it needs to be third-party verified. There's another threshold where it needs to be self-reported. And so that's something that can also be done with this technology. We just haven't fully fleshed that out because it's really just a peer-to-peer. It's the holder presenting information directly to that verifier. You don't need an issuer in that situation. It may be for another credential, but not for that specific information. And so that's another piece that we're looking at. And then the other aspect for looking at use cases that we found useful was where business efficiency is important. So often something that needs to be reported very frequently with a high frequency rate, such as a daily thing or a weekly thing or a monthly thing. Those are common places to see where we can use verifiable credential technology to essentially automate some of these manual processes that people are doing, where they might have to fill out an Excel spreadsheet and then email it to somebody else every week. Right? Those are other good places to look at to improve the business efficiency, data accuracy, all these kinds of things along the way.
Do you see, just to extend that thinking, so, and I think this is becoming a good blueprint to this conversation for folks that are in similar positions looking to create digital trust ecosystems. There's just a tremendous amount of nuggets in this conversation. It's great starting off from a regulatory process. You kind of get a lot of the rules and the governance you're able to leverage from there. You're sort of transitioning, Kyle, you mentioned the Web 1, Web 2. So you can maybe have some Web 1 processes that are jumping to Web 3. We're calling it Web 3. I don't know what we're calling it, to this digital trust ecosystem. And you could also have kind of Web 2 if you're using email and PDFs or just enterprise softwares or stuff like that. That's jumping down to this new layer as well. So if you're starting from the regulatory process, are you already seeing opportunities where what's possible now with this technology may alter the regulation or the legislation? And like one idea I'm thinking of here is like if you have reporting needs on an annual basis or a monthly basis or whatever, what stops this from just becoming kind of a continuous reporting process if you're really able to reduce the friction and the costs of actually generating these reports and issuing trusted data? Is there a space where you see what's possible now with the technology perhaps may alter the rules of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And that's I'm relatively new to understanding the technology. But as I get deeper and deeper into this project, that has been one sort of revelation for me, thinking about how this, not only we can map existing regulatory processes, but how this technology could actually transform them to make them more efficient and trusted. If say that IoT device had a wallet, and it was being it was the entity that was issuing to the regulator, or the reading from the satellite that's overhead from the operation, being able to go directly to the regulator, I think. And that's just the beginning. Like, I think that could, as you're saying, Matthew, like it could actually change the way that the regulation is not just how the reporting is done, but also over time potentially find efficiencies in how the regulation is written or the processes around it.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that we found with the regulations where it does not specify in the regulation anything about the technology generally. So right now for the regulatory process, for the GHG emissions reporting, it says that the form of reporting is up to the director for that program. And so the director has defined, again, in the governance kind of a sense, the process for how that's actually done. That's not written into law, but the process has been defined by the director in essentially what we would call a governance framework. It's right now publicly exposed on the website. And so that's where we can see how that can be updated more frequently, or there could be other options, so there's multiple options for reporting. We like to think that the current process could be more efficient, but that has a requirement where you need to have, let's say, Microsoft Outlook and Microsoft Word and maybe Adobe Acrobat, right? And you can do your business with that set of technology. But there's a more efficient process which would be used, Hyperledger Aries wallets, to do presentation exchanges, right? That would be a potentially more efficient process. I'm not sure, though, if it's going to influence the regulation to, let's say, have a higher frequency of reporting. Maybe it would. If the the industry transitions to that more efficient process, then it would be reasonable for a regulatory body to ask for the data more frequently, and maybe if that made sense, right? And so that instead of yearly reporting, maybe it's twice a year, maybe it's quarterly, something like that. But that's definitely to be seen.
Yeah, to be clear, this is total blue sky thinking between
Yes.
Kyle and I. We're not making any guarantees here, but I think once you start thinking along these paths, there are some pretty cool opportunities to be explored.
The other thing to say about that is when it comes to, so that's businesses. When we talk about some of the use cases with citizens interacting with the government, there always sort of needs to be a very low bar of entry for access to government services. And so we can't enforce their requirement to be using, let's say, a wallet or even to have a cell phone. There's accessibility questions and all these kind of come into play when we're looking at use cases for citizens interacting with government services.
Back to earlier in the conversation, we're talking a little bit about what type of data we're collecting, how is the data being generated and such. And then kind of taking the angle where we're talking about your involvement a little bit more in the early stages to just fuel the start of this ecosystem, and then maybe taking a step back and just playing your role in it. Do you see different types of things that as different types of services or different types of offerings as a ministry or as a group you'll be able to give down the line to an ecosystem once this is going? And just one parallel example, like in the automotive industry, for example, governments tell them they could use certain types of engines or certain types of this, or are there going to be other areas where you think your group or just infrastructure providers or government ministries in general, once they've kind of got these things kicked off, are there new business models for yourselves or new ways of injecting value into the ecosystem that you see possible?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this question. So John Jordan, who leads the team at Citizen Services, he has some really interesting thinking around standard offerings that that their group could have for the government. The regulatory reporting could be one of them. There's certain offerings around individual identity that his team are doing pretty amazing work on. And I think, my head is in the regulatory reporting world, I think that there's more, like, there's a lot of creative thinking that's going on around this, beyond what, what our ecosystem is doing. Within our own ecosystem, I do think that there's opportunities for access to markets that have a emphasis on sustainable products. Like, for example, the London Metal Exchange has a digital passport for sustainability information about the companies that sell on their exchange. That's more of a voluntary mechanism. I think there's some types of metals that it's no longer voluntary. They have to use that platform. But in general, it's more about sort of reputation, I think, at the moment. Whereas in the natural gas space, there are digital markets now that price and exchange the environmental attributes of certified natural gas. So there's market opportunities, I think, that are opening up as a part of consumers wanting to understand how their products have been produced and whether or not they've used sustainable practices in the production of the products that they're using. There's also all sorts of different interesting use cases around carbon markets and carbon accounting. The World Bank has a really cool initiative called the Climate Warehouse, and they're just about to launch something called the Climate Action Data Trust, which is looking to harmonize data for all of the different offset carbon markets that exist. So I think that there's a lot of different applications. Our ecosystem is focusing on, for the moment, on use cases where the governance is fairly mapped out already. But I think that there's a lot of different directions that these things can be taken in.
Yeah, one of the things that Kyle, we were together for a bit at IAW this year. One of the really interesting takeaways for me was just there was less discussion nowadays on the technology and the different standards or credential types or just you name it. Less fighting about these little things. I think we're starting to see a lot more convergence on the technology side, and it's going to be kind of a Darwinian play out, like whichever ones end up winning here. But there was just a lot more conversations around just governance or how do I trust something. And so it's quite exciting to see the work that your group is doing. The industry is there. It's at the governance standpoint. I think if you're operating in a regulated environment or even a non-regulated environment, there's a lot of learnings and takeaways that could be taken from the work that you're doing and continuing to do. And I think, to follow up to my last question, Nancy, I think at the end of the day, it's more value is going to be created for not only BC companies, but for global companies that are able to just take this model and make sure that digital trust is able to happen quicker, and it will just have tremendous downstream impacts. Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.